Right, well, it's one of the biggest nights of the year, as I said, in politics anyway. And as I said at the top of the show, for you at home, me too, we're all taxpayers, well, it's a bit like our annual shareholders meeting. You know, we get a good look at the books tonight. We get to see how our money is being spent and what the coming revenue growth might look like. And how your family too is going to fare, because we're really going to start to get into this recession proper once we have those payments come away, JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and the worst of the health impacts of this virus start to ease. To help us understand the budget better, let's bring in former Reserve Bank official, former Chief Economist to the Prime Minister, Dr Andrew Stone in Sydney. Andrew, thank you for your time. Great to have you on the show. You've been in the engine room of budgets, so I think this is a great sort of insight for people tonight. Look, I'm anticipating, given the pandemic and the election last year, that there's been all the usual budget work done, but it would have been vastly different from the time that you and I have done budgets, given all the other constraints, let alone the physical constraints of this sort of restriction period. Take people through how it works in terms of the macro of a budget year, the cycle of meetings, the way policies get worked up, debated, discarded, and brought back again, and a whole lot of judgments made about where Australia might be in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years' time.
Sure thing. In a sense, my take would be this year's budget will in some ways not been that different to a budget. It's just that for all the officials involved in it and all the politicians, it will have seemed like an endless process, because already even in normal times, a budget is a very time-consuming and all-consuming process. So even before Christmas, normally the budget is presented in May, second Tuesday in May, but the process typically begins in earnest even before Christmas, and there'll be the whole process, usually two sort of main different streams. Ministers will be being asked to bring forward proposals about savings that they can make so as to allow new measures to be funded, as well as new policy proposals, all the things that ministers would like to get across the line in terms of the big ideas that they have that they want to prosecute. The process then really goes into overdrive basically after Australia Day, and there's a whole back and forth process involving the officials and the government ministers and so forth, in which every single savings proposal, every single new policy proposal of ministers is reviewed. Some will be sent back where people will be asked to provide more detail, or will be given conditional approval. Others will be asked to find more savings and so forth. At the same time, there's a constant back and forth with the officials in Treasury and elsewhere in the bureaucracy, both about what the economic outlook's looking like to determine the sort of overall envelope of parameters that for the budget, but also because with every decision that's made, you have to consult with all the relevant departments that might be affected, all the relevant ministers, to ensure that everybody's had their say, had their input, so that you don't get unexpected effects. So it's just very intense.
Can I just stop you there? Because, you're basically there, give or take sort of March, April, at the pointy end of a May delivery of budget. And of course, that's when the worst of the health impacts of the coronavirus hit, when we didn't know so much as we do now about the disease, and the whole country was in lockdown. So all of that preparatory work you've talked about, going back maybe 8 to 10 months, all of that's gone. And of course, the big spending starts. Now, I want to get into some of the jargon, because we're going to get into the detail a bit later on, and I hate assuming knowledge all the time. We talk about forward estimates. Well, that's just the forward years and estimates of spending or revenue in those forward years. We talk about gross debt. We talk about net debt. We talk about stuff being on budget and stuff being off budget. Run us through the net debt, gross debt argument, and how you treat things in terms of how they're presented in the budget.
Sure. Okay. Well, a couple of the key terms that will be constantly used tonight are the deficit and then debt figures, and there'll be questions about which particular debt figure to focus on. So the deficit that's presented each year, it's easy to think about in terms of your own family. The deficit is the difference over the course of a year between how much income you bring in and how much outlays you have. So for the government, most of their income is tax revenue. It's the money they take off you and me and so forth. But the government each year has to report on how much it took in and whether its outlays, its spending either on roads or rail or transfers, unemployment benefits and so forth, whether they've exceeded that income or not. And if they have, that's a deficit. If they haven't, that's a surplus. That's what happens each year. And then if you consistently run deficits, you run up debt. But you can also, of course, just like a household again, you can run up debt in other ways, in the same way as if a household, if you go out and buy a house, then you suddenly take on a whole lot of extra debt. Of course, you've got an offsetting asset for that, namely the house. So that gets you to the question of debt, which is the sort of accumulation of all these yearly outcomes. And then there are two main figures that often get quoted. One is net debt, one is gross debt. They get at the
And
idea.
just let me just jump in there. I think I might have 2 graphs there on net debt and gross debt we could put up there so people could see those things, but keep going.
Okay. So the main difference here is that gross debt just shows all of the borrowing, the total borrowings that the government's undertaken. But for certain things, certain programs that the government runs, they also lend out money as well. And the biggest example of that is student loans. So the government will borrow a whole lot of money in the markets, take it in, put it in the consolidated revenue, and then they'll say to students each year, do you want to pay your fees up front, or do you want to, to pay your fees, do you want to pay it yourself up front, or do you want to borrow some money from the government and we'll lend it to you and you only have to pay it back over time? As a result, the Commonwealth actually has made tens of billions of dollars of loans to several million students out there in higher education. That's a good example where you've taken on debt, but you also lent it out, so you have relatively very little effect on net debt, but your gross debt has gone up a lot. That's why, in a lot of ways, I think net debt is the more interesting figure to focus on. That said, because we're starting to get to such large debt levels with the spending that's gone on recently, the distinction is becoming less critical. Back 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, and just on that. Just on the HEX point, though, you make there, I mean, HEX bears an asset on the books, and it's not counted. It's counted in your gross debt, but not counted in your net debt. That presupposes, of course, that these students are going to pay it back. And there was one in the paper yesterday in the Daily Telegraph, $600,000 one student had racked up in HEX debt. Well on the way to $1 million of study HEX debt. Now, I can't see how any student's going to pay that back over time. So some of this money that you might hope to get back as a taxpayer into the government's coffers won't happen. I want to get into some analysis. Paul Kelly wrote over, I think it was last week, towards the end of last week, but he talked about the philosophy behind this budget, and he made a point that it'll be a budget of pragmatism here, not ideology, because of the way in which they were trying, both Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, to deal with the crisis. Now, you're pretty crispy dry on economics. You don't like excess spending. Would you say it's pragmatism over ideology? And do you get a sense that the government, once it's through this sort of COVID period, is going to get back to its conservative roots? Are we going to have a whole lot of backbenchers in and around the Liberal Party and National Party who become addicted to spending?
That's the real risk. I'd make a couple of points. First is that Paul Kelly's right in a sense that actually when things are moving very fast as they were back in March and April, you're forced in a sense just to say, well, look, once you've made a decision, for example, that you're going to have all these lockdowns, that you're going to have school closures and so forth, many of these actually driven by state governments rather than the federal government, but nevertheless, once that's occurred, you have to make snap, very quick decisions, and pragmatism, there's a lot to be said for pragmatism. That said, in the longer term, I don't think there's actually as much of a contrast here as perhaps it sounds when you say pragmatism versus ideology. A different word for ideology here might be convictions, and the point is you should always, even when you're making snap decisions, be weighing the way in which you're doing them against your convictions about what is the best way in which to get support to the economy and so forth. And the coalition will have to think very hard about, already I think, the immediate crisis, in my view, has well passed. In fact, my own view is that we've taken on vastly more debt than we should have done. We've done that because of the way we responded to the virus, which I think was an overreaction. But be that as may, that's water under the bridge. But it's critical that the coalition, sooner rather than later, gets back to focusing on getting, not continuing to spend up big and absolutely not allowing a mindset to develop where people think, oh yeah, we can just go and $1 billion here, $1 billion there. And pretty soon you're talking about real money, and my goodness me, we're really talking about real money at the moment.
We are. I find him talking about it in the media. It doesn't sound substantial now, unless it's not just $1 billion or $2 billion, it's tens of billions.